So you can't see this, but hopefully you can hear it. Behind every Boise State Public Radio podcast is a team working hard to bring you stories that matter. So if you value podcasts like this one, please support them. Hit donate at boisestatepublicradio.org. Thanks.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. We are going to get you up to date on the news that made headlines this week here in our region. Quite a bit to get to today. And our panel includes Nate Eaton, news director at eastidahonews.com, Carly Flandro, reporter with Idaho Ed News, Christina Lords, the editor-in-chief of the Idaho Capital Sun, and Don Day, the founder and editor of BoiseDev.com. Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Hello.
So, Christina, I want to start our conversation today talking about a little bit of nuance or putting some nuance together around a legislative memorial that was recently passed in the Idaho Legislature. First off, tell us what this memorial is, what it means, and what it does, if anything.
Okay. Yeah, good. All good questions. So House Joint Memorial 1, I think there's a lot of confusion around what it does. And this is something that we've been hearing so much from people in our inbox, our readers, and just when I'm out and about talking to people and I tell them I'm a journalist, this is the first thing they ask about. So it's important to know that memorials are different than actual laws that change Idaho code. So a memorial is essentially asking, in this case, the U.S. Supreme Court to do something. In this case, to re-examine its ruling that provided 14th Amendment protections to same-sex marriage. And that case that the U.S. Supreme Court decided said that states cannot ban same-sex marriage within their own jurisdictions. Idaho, in its own constitution, after voters decided on this issue in 2006, our constitution says that a marriage is between one man and one woman, but the Supreme Court, in its ruling in 2015, superseded this state law. So it's basically asking the Supreme Court, hey, can you go back and re-examine this idea? We think the state should be able to decide this. I think the thing that's missing in these conversations and that maybe people don't understand is that we kind of need to actually look at the Dobbs decision in 2022, which said that abortion issues should be decided by the states and not the federal government. In his concurring opinions, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas said that other court cases, including the ones that decided same-sex marriage, they're legal. They should be re-examined, and that those decisions should be left to the states. So this actually caused a lot of concern for people in Congress and with President Biden, who moved to pass the Respect for Marriage Act in 2022. So that means that there are protections for same-sex marriage and actually interracial marriage that were passed into federal law. It means that we're not just relying on Supreme Court case law or precedent that can be overturned. So essentially, the legislature can ask the Supreme Court to re-examine this, and we know there's at least one Supreme Court justice that would support that, right? But it's not going to change same-sex marriage in Idaho. It's not going to repeal same-sex marriage. It's not going to disallow same-sex marriage from going forward because we now have those federal protections due to that law that was passed in 2022. So I think that's really kind of the part that's missing for a lot of people. And, I think Ilana Rubel, who serves in the Idaho House, brought this up, that she's a Democrat and she's saying this is just to scare people. This is just to get people riled up. It's to make, gay and lesbian people in Idaho feel unsafe. But it's not going to actually change the law. It's not going to actually disallow same-sex marriage from taking place in Idaho. So there is some nuance there.
And with that said, Christina, it really goes back to what you mentioned, which is the Respect for Marriage Act, because Congress passed this in 2022. Correct. And that's the critical part, right? That Congress, this was an act of Congress.
So federal law will always supersede state law. It will always take precedent. And so you could say, well, Congress is now made up of a majority Republican in the House, Senate, the presidency, and some
Mhm.
would argue the Supreme Court. So they could go back and look at all of this again. But, Congress has a very hard time agreeing on dang near anything. And so I think that would be a really uphill battle to repeal the Respect for Marriage Act. And so it would take a lot to get back to that place where Congress is voting on this again. I think it's also
Mhm.
important to note that this is only passed in the Idaho House, so that means that it needs to go through on a state level. This memorial needs to go through that same process in the Idaho Senate. So it needs to be introduced. It needs to go through a full public hearing where Idahoans could weigh in and come to that hearing and let people know how they feel about if this is the best way that the legislature should be spending its time. And then it would be voted on if it passes out of committee by the full Senate before it then goes to the Supreme Court. So we're not fully through that process yet. There's still a lot of time to provide feedback, and the Senate could take it up. I'd be surprised if it didn't, but it could also say we're actually going to focus on other things and we're going to look at other bills and not even address this. So there's still a little bit to go as far as the legislative process on this one.
So, Nate, there are a lot of stories that are coming out from all over the United States in regards to ICE agents and raids. In particular, ICE agents detaining U.S. citizens. There's been a lot of confusion, in particular, around people who are Puerto Rican and ICE agents mistaking this for not being U.S. citizens. With all of that said, I actually read a story about a man in Pocatello that was detained and he was a U.S. citizen. I think it even said he was in the military. So I set all of this up, Nate, because this story is being debunked.
Right. That story you read likely did not happen, at least based on our research. We see on the national news, if you watch it, that there's video of people being, taken into custody by ICE from different large cities across the country. And that is causing many, many, many people to worry that it's happening in our local communities. And the story that you referenced was based on a Facebook post. And we've been trying to track down the origin of that Facebook post, but it's a woman saying that her fiance is a California-born Native American Hispanic Navy veteran who was detained in Pocatello for 4 hours. He was abused, multiple injuries, cuffed, thrown to the ground, and it spread like wildfire on Facebook to the point that the Pocatello Police Department issued a statement saying, we've been made aware of the allegations. We've contacted ICE. It did not happen. It was false. And now we have the Blaine County Sheriff just yesterday issuing a statement because similar rumors are spreading in his community and saying, we've looked into this. The claims are unsubstantiated. There's no evidence of them. It's not happening. But people are worried. It is causing panic. Thus far, East Idaho News has not been able to confirm any solid instances where this has actually happened, at least in our parts of Idaho.
And with that said, I do want to make it clear that, folks, there have been other incidences in the United States. In particular, there was one in outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, earlier this week, where U.S. citizens were mistaken and they were illegally detained by ICE. So I appreciate, Nate, that we need to have correct information, right? Because there are these issues happening, but at the same time, if someone puts false information out there, it really impedes everything that's going on.
Absolutely. And we, of course, as the media, we want to know if these things are happening, and we want to either clear up the rumors, clarify them if we can, or actually report on the instances as they're happening if they are about to happen. So, anybody listening that might have legitimate information or want us to look into it anywhere in Idaho, I'm sure any reporter would like to get that information. But just because something is floating around Facebook and it might seem like a wild story or a true story, you always want to verify and make sure that it's accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Carly, ICE raids, as Nate mentioned, are putting fear into a lot of folks. Let's talk about schools, because the new administration did say that schools are no longer going to be sanctuary spaces, that ICE agents can come into schools. So I'm curious if Idaho education leaders have said anything about this.
Yeah, so in the wake of the policy change, Idaho school leaders reached out to the state for guidance on how to handle it. And State Superintendent Debbie Critchfield responded this week with a letter reiterating some legal things. So, for example, all children in the United States have an equal right to enroll and participate in public schools. And Idaho public schools do not collect information about students or families' immigration status. And in fact, they're not allowed to, and therefore they cannot share it with law enforcement agencies. And then in terms of how to respond if an ICE agent came to a school, she said school districts and charters should already have those policies in place. So I reached out to a couple of school districts who are communicating with parents and families about the policy change and how they're handling it. Most shared similar information to Critchfield's, and some also offered counseling support for students experiencing anxiety or stress. And one school district in American Falls, their superintendent, Randy Jensen, he kind of walked me through what would happen. He said if an ICE agent came to the school and requested access to a student, he would first consult with the district's legal counsel and notify parents immediately before granting access. And that seems like it's pretty standard practice. And then there's also been concerns that this could deter some students from coming to school, but the superintendents I talked to said there's been no noticeable impact on attendance at this point.
All right, appreciate that update, Carly. So Don, talk to us about a recent incident between the Albertson heirs and Payette Lake. And I should note, I mean, in all seriousness, folks, this really is a warning that you need to pay attention to signs when they say that there's actual thin ice.
Yeah. Well said. So last week, I'm gonna take you behind the veil.
Seriously.
I don't know what else to say. That's pretty true.
Yeah.
Take you behind the veil of our news process. Last weekend on Saturday, we heard that a UTV had gone onto the Payette Lake and fallen through the ice. And some other local news outlets did the story fairly quickly, and I was asking our new reporter for Valley Lookout, Drew, like, hey, can we get this done? He's like, yeah, I've got it. I've got some more stuff. Just give me some time. And me being an editor and impatient, I'm like, hurry up. What he got was that the UTV was driven by Dan Scott of McCall, and he also had a passenger, Richard Scott. That's according to the Valley County Sheriff's Office. Now, if you recognize the name Scott, it's probably because you know that Dan Scott is the former president and general manager of Shore Lodge and Whitetail Company. Shore Lodge and Whitetail are owned by the family, the family of Joe Albertson. The family tree is a little complicated, but the Albertson's grocery store heirs, and Dan Scott is currently working with Boise development firm Al Scott, and Al Scott is short for Albertsons and Scott, clear as mud. So what happened is they drove the UTV onto the ice on Payette Lake on a sunny Saturday, and the ice could not handle the weight of the UTV and the two passengers, and it crashed through the ice and sunk to the bottom in less than a minute, according to Drew's reporting. It's still down there. They're kind of trying to figure out what the economic impact of an engine full of gas might be on the lake, and they're working through that. Officials in McCall say this has actually been happening a bunch, maybe not quite to that level, but people out on the ice causing issues. The ice isn't safe, and I will say I've walked on the ice on Payette Lake too. I'm not alone. You're not alone. But I don't go any further out than maybe it's shallow enough for me to be up to my ankles. And I've done it in a while. Maybe I've gotten smarter. But maybe. Even in some of the pictures, and maybe in Drew's story, you see people skating out on the ice, and he just went up on a random day to take the picture, and it's just be careful, people. I don't like to take a stance, but come on, let's be careful.
Well, and the thing is too, though, it puts first responders in danger because they have to go and rescue you. So again, if it says warning thin ice, just pay attention. With that said, though, Don, okay, you mentioned Valley Lookout. Tell us about this real quick before we go to break, because this is your latest local news site that you launched.
Yeah, we launched Boise Dev in 2016 or 2018, depending on how you look at it. And this last spring, my partner and wife, Kara Jackson, who you hear on Idaho Matters sometimes, put together a business plan, and we wrote a grant to start a local news site that will cover Valley County and the Meadows Valley. So New Meadows, McCall, Cascade, Donnelly, Lake Fork, Yellow Pine, and all the places in between. And the idea here is to make sure that first we're serving the people who live there locally, but also all the people who play and love the McCall area. We were really lucky to hire Drew Dodson. He is a longtime reporter up there and is based in Donnelly. And so we have boots on the ground in Valley County. I couldn't be more thrilled, and we've been really excited to launch this product. And it's valleylookout.com. You'll see some of his stories on boisedev.com too. It's really fun to have 2 local news sites now.
Well, I have to say, I think it's great, Don. There's so many people who, there's so much going on up there, and it's great that the folks who live there are now get another source of news information, but also even for those of us who live outside of that area who want to stay abreast of what's going on. So best of luck in that new venture.
Thanks.
So, Carly, the latest results from the federal exam, which a lot of folks refer to as the nation's report card, came out this week. Now, before we get into the details, can you just quickly tell us what this exam is?
Yeah, so it's a mandated federal exam, and its formal name is the National Assessment of Education Progress. And the acronym is NAEP, so some people call it NAEP. So a representative sample of elementary and middle school students from across the country take this every 2 years. So it's an important gauge of how students are doing nationally. And we also like to dial in and look at Idaho results. But there is one caveat I want listeners to know. So in Idaho, about 1,800 students across 90 schools took this exam last year. And that's a pretty small sample size compared to other tests. Like the fall reading exam that we had, 86,000 students took that. And then 165,000 students took the ISAT last spring. So that's just something to keep in mind as we talk about results.
Okay, so let's talk about results, because from a national level, Carly, results were not great, especially when we look at where we were before the pandemic and since the pandemic. But with that said, how did Idaho fare?
Yeah, like you said, the national results were not great. They were characterized as alarming and sobering. Idaho had similar results in some ways. Fourth and eighth grade reading and math proficiency levels either stagnated or declined, with one exception. That's fourth grade math results, which were on the upswing. And when I talk about proficiency levels, that means the percent of test takers who are at grade level or above in math or reading. So while those results demonstrate minimal academic growth, there is a bright spot. Idaho test takers had higher proficiency rates than their national peers in reading and math. So for example, 32% of eighth graders tested in Idaho were reading at grade level or higher. While that's not the greatest number, it does beat the national rate of 29%.
Okay, but so we can at least see some progress, right?
Well, the only place that there was really progress for the Idaho kids, like I mentioned, was the fourth graders in math. But State Superintendent Debbie Critchfield, she celebrated the Idaho students consistently outperform nationwide scores, but she also acknowledged there's room for improvement. So in math, state education leaders are working to develop essential math standards and better prepare classroom teachers. And on the reading side of things, teachers are receiving training in the science of reading and effective dyslexia interventions. So she's hoping that'll translate to more progress going forward.
All right. Well, I appreciate that update. Nate, let's head back over to East Idaho. Just a tragic story coming out. 2 people were killed. Talk to us about this, because it was in their home, right? But a propane tank broke. So what happened?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. This happened in Kilgore, which is a tiny little community. I think the population is around 30 people in Clark County. And what the sheriff is telling us is that on Tuesday, an elderly couple found a gas leak and they called the propane company to report it. And within an hour or so of the propane company responding, the tank exploded and it blew the man out of the front door of the home. And he
Oh,
survived, but then passed away. And his wife was missing at the time, and she was found inside of the home. It immediately caught on fire. The interesting thing is that the sheriff is saying this all started because snow fell off the roof, heavy snow, and broke the propane line that led into the
mm,
house. And so just a real unfortunate thing. The house is completely destroyed. The couple has both of them died, and now they're investigating to see exactly, how old was the propane line
hmm.
and if anything could have been done to prevent it. But you don't often hear about snow causing something like this, but it is something I guess to keep in mind if snow is piling up on the roof, especially as we go into spring, that it can melt and slide off and
Yeah.
cause damage to property or other things around the home.
Just a good reminder. Yeah. Thanks, Nate, for that. Christina, let's head back over to the State House. There was a bill introduced earlier this week that would give the governor veto power over voter initiatives. So, first, let's remind folks what a voter initiative is and the fact that we as voters have passed certain things into law.
Right. So the Idaho Constitution provides the option for Idaho voters to bring forth ballot initiatives and referendums, which would repeal a law. Ballot initiatives create a law, referendums repeal them. Um, uh, so this is something that's well established, has been around for a long time. But this bill in particular was introduced by Representative Bruce Skog, who's a Republican from Nampa, and it would allow the Idaho governor to veto laws passed directly by voters through the ballot initiative process. Um, and the reason for this, Skog says, during the introductory hearing for the bill, he defended it by saying this would essentially use the same process that laws must go through in the legislature, where the House and Senate look at something and it goes to the governor for consideration. And the governor has veto power over the laws that end up on his desk via the legislature. Under this bill, if the ballot initiative passed with 2/3 of the vote, the governor would not be able to veto it. So it has this very high threshold. If
Mhm.
it passes by 2/3, then the governor wouldn't be able to touch it. But if it doesn't, the governor would have this veto power. Um, and I think it's important to note that while Skog was introducing this bill, he said legislators, while they're considering new laws, they get to hear from subject matter experts, stakeholders, the public during the public hearing process, right? He said that, and I'm going to quote this here. He said that the governor's veto is a good protection for a misinformed electorate if they don't get the information like we get to have. But many people are responding to our story about this proposal. They're really bristling at this idea that Idahoans are misinformed about the ballot initiatives that they work to, get valid signatures for or that they vote on in the past. This is also something important to note that this is one of four bills that have been introduced in the last few weeks that would affect the initiative process in Idaho. I think the last time I was on Idaho Matters, I talked a lot about how
Mhm.
whenever there is an initiative brought forth by grassroots organizations or by paid signature gatherers, there's almost always some response in the Idaho legislature to make the initiative process harder. And it'll be interesting to see where these bills go, if this one has any legs to stand on by our research and by Luke Mayville with Reclaim Idaho also said this doesn't exist in state law anywhere else that we can find or that he can find. This would be unique to Idaho. He called it really unethical and just a kind of a slap in the face to Idaho
Mhm.
voters that would work hard to bring an initiative that they cared about, and then have one person essentially be able to say we're going to veto this and not do this law. So, well, this is anything that revolves around voting or initiatives or access to government. The Idaho Capitol Sun will be closely following all of these bills to see where they end up. This is just the very beginning of the process for this
Mhm.
particular bill. So, it'll come back before the committee to be able to have a full public hearing, and we'll cover that as it happens.
Well, what stands out to me about this, Christina, is that these bills, when these voter initiatives, rather, excuse me,
Yeah.
they are by and large passed across party lines. Because of the requirements, you cannot have registered Democrats in the state of Idaho couldn't pass any of these. Let's just be clear on that. So then to have a state lawmaker call the electorate misinformed, it feels almost like a slap in the face. I mean, I'm not surprised by people being upset about this because there are so many requirements, not just to get this on the ballot, but then to get it passed. You have to have voters from all parties, from all walks of life in the state of Idaho say yes to this. And these don't always pass, as we just saw in November.
Right. I think the thing that's interesting about ballot initiatives is that often, I've been covering the legislature since 2013, and a lot of these issues that end up as a ballot initiative are brought forth to the legislature repeatedly to say, we're really interested in expanding Medicaid, or we're really interested in including more funding for public education, or we're interested in opening Idaho's closed primaries. Can you as a legislature address these issues? And often the legislature is unwilling to do that. And so there is a process for the legislature to kind of address these issues as they're coming up. The initiative process kind of comes out of this frustration that nothing is happening or nothing is moving on these issues. So then the voters, get organized and decide, like, okay, let's let the voters decide this. It's protected. It's a protected right in the Idaho Constitution that voters can bring a ballot initiative forward. And we see time and time again that the legislature says, we're actually the body that gets to decide Idaho's laws. And they put up these barriers and these they make it harder for the initiative to qualify. There's all sorts of cases that have gone to the Supreme Court that argue this. The Supreme Court has said, this is actually a protective avenue for laws to be passed in Idaho from the voters. And I think it's always interesting after we go through initiative process that the very next legislative session, the legislators are trying to tinker with the process and oftentimes make it more difficult for initiatives to pass.
There is definitely a pattern there. Dawn, the mayor of Boise had to step in and make a tie-breaking vote earlier this week. Now, this has to do with allowing hard alcohol in Boise Park. So tell us about this, but this is really for like big events. So what does this mean for like a big event like Tree Fort?
Yeah, Tree Fort Music Festival and Boise Pride approached the city of Boise and asked them to consider allowing hard alcohol liquor to be sold at events that are held in Boise parks. Obviously, Boise Pride is held primarily in Cecil D. Andrus Park, and Tree Fort Music Festival a few years ago moved its main stage to Julia Davis Park. They've been allowed to sell beer and wine, as many events have been, and they came to the city and said, hey, it would really help our profitability and our ability to thrive if we could sell mixed drinks. The council brought forth an initial proposal, according to reporting from our Margaret Carmel, and split 3-3 on it, and expressed some concerns about overconsumption and public safety. The ordinance was tweaked slightly by City Council President Colin Nash, who gave this a 1-year trial run where it would expire in January. The council again voted and split on the same lines. And one of the things that's been interesting about covering Boise City Council over the last year is the council is tying more often than it used to. And it's also a little bit more unpredictable. We're seeing the vote counts kind of line up in ways that I often am not able to predict. In this case, Council President Nash, Council President Pro Tem Meredith Stead, and Councilmember Jimmy Halliburton decided to vote for the ordinance, while Council members Jordan Morales, Kathy Corliss, and Lucy Willits all voted no. They listed a variety of reasons for that. The mayor had to break the tie. That's how these things work. The mayor didn't offer any comments, but did vote to allow this to go through. So the outcome is at Tree Fort Music Festival coming up here next month. Oh, it's still January. I can't believe it's still January, but
well,
March,
okay. I mean, yeah. March.
Crying out
Yeah.
loud, January never ends. And for Boise Pride this fall, they will be allowed to sell mixed drinks, and the city and the council will then reevaluate and look to see if they want to continue this, make changes, get rid of it for next year.
Don, you brought up a really interesting point, though, very quickly, is how voting has changed on the council in the last year. I mean, I would assume that has a lot to do with the fact that now you're voting within districts and not a council at large. And that was kind of the whole point of it, right? Was that maybe we're actually getting representation from the actual areas where people live. So I think that was just an interesting point that you brought up.
Yeah, one of my favorite topics, and you said very quickly, but yeah, I mean, most of the council members live within about 8 blocks of each other before, and now they live throughout the city, and that has brought a diversity of perspectives to the council. And so, yeah, I watch it sometimes, and I'm like, these alignments, like politically, 5 members of the council are Democrats and 1 is a Republican, but they tie a lot, and it's been really fascinating to watch just from a political science standpoint.
Don, we've got a developing story happening, actually. We found out about this right as we were going into the program, and you've got some more information for us. This is in regards to Eckert Bridge in Boise. So if folks are wondering where that is, it is right by Barber Valley. It's right by the park where Barber Park. Thank you. Where people go to float the river in the summertime. Don, tell us what's going on, because as I said, the bridge is closed.
Yeah, it's closed. The Ada County Highway District held an emergency special commission meeting at 11:30 this morning. So for those of you listening on the live run just about an hour ago, and they found some severe decay on the bridge. They check these things every 5 years, which seems like a long time, but they did the last evaluation. It was fine 5 years ago. And now they are worried about the decay to the level that they went to the commission and asked for it to be closed. They're going to hold a news conference later this afternoon for those of you on live airing, and will give us some more information. As Boise Dev had reported a while ago, they have a concept study that they've been working on to look at replacing this bridge. If you've ever been over it, so picture going to Barber Park, and Barber Park is like the entrance is like in the middle of like a bridge over the river, and then the bridge over the canal. It goes around this like crazy sloping corner. It's always kind of sketchy. I used to live out there, and I always hated going that way.
I actually drove that bridge twice a day back when my kids were in daycare because their daycare was in that. Yes, I mean, I know if you're in East Boise, you've gone over this bridge
a ton. And so they had kind of been at work on getting it replaced. They're now looking at trying to accelerate that and moving funding around. People might remember the Cloverdale Road Bridge over Interstate 84 was hit by a semi-truck in 2018 and caused some damage to that bridge, closing it. And ACHD had to do a similar thing. They're looking at kind of a similar process here to hopefully speed that up. But right now, the bridge is closed, and Barber Valley access is kind of funny because there's not a lot of ways into that. And obviously population has really grown out there. So getting back and forth. There's also a pedestrian bridge, which is a major greenbelt link that's ostensibly, we're going to double check, but we believe is also closed as part of this. So if you're going that way, you're going to have to find an alternate route.
Okay, so Don, clarify then what all is closed. So it's that Eckert Bridge portion. Okay.
It's the Eckert Bridge. And the reason I say the pedestrian bridge is we need to double check. The pedestrian part appears to be connected to the bridge, which I think is closed. It's one of the questions that we want to ask in the news conference.
Okay.
If it's just vehicle traffic or if it's bike traffic, because people on their bikes use that a lot. And so just keep in mind that it's all closed. We'll update our story on boisedev.com with more clarity on that.
And I mean, that for folks who do travel out there, I mean, this could be going on for quite a while, Don. I mean, this isn't like, oh, let us close the bridge, re-inspect it, and we're going to reopen it. I mean, this sounds like, especially what they said, if it's similar to the Cloverdale overpass. I mean, I don't want to speculate, but it could be a while. Yeah,
I mean, it does sound like they are. I mean, they closed it down, and they're indicating they got to hurry up the replacement. This came out in a commission meeting, and we haven't had a chance to ask questions. So that's why there's some ambiguity here. But you don't replace a bridge overnight. Even if they hurry, it's going to take some time. So think about the floating season. That's a very incredibly popular area. and getting to and from Barber Park would be quite difficult without going over the East Park Center Bridge, which is over by the other side of Barber Valley. I can't think of, there's really no landmarks there, but the other side. So you're
It's
just
like
gonna have
bound
to stick
crossing.
with me. Yeah, on the bound crossing side, that's a good way to put it. Or you have to go out to Highway 21, both of which are a long stretch. So the Idaho Shakespeare Festival, access to that for people who live in Southeast Boise would be impeded. So we'll keep on top of this, and we'll update as we know more.
Okay, sounds good. And our Troy Oppie's on this as well. So we will, of course, dig into this
yeah.
more on Idaho Matters as well. All right, so Christina, let's head back to the State House because the Idaho House passed a bill this week that would not allow government and schools to put mask mandates in place in order to help stop the spread of disease. First off, what I find interesting about this, Christina, is that we didn't have a mask mandate in the state of Idaho ever during the pandemic. Second thing that stood out to me was that there was at least one Republican who voted against this. So talk to us about all of this.
Right. You're correct that the state itself and the governor never had a full statewide mask mandate at any point during the pandemic. And the reason for that, and this is what you're getting at with one Republican who voted against the bill, essentially because the governor and Representative Rick Cheatham, Republican from Pocatello, both have expressed concerns about that idea. It essentially prevents local schools, local governments, local cities from making local decisions. And, I think Republicans traditionally have always tried to err on the side of local control for things. And so that's what Representative Cheatham said. That's what the governor has said in the past is we don't want to remove the ability from, the city of Pocatello or the city of Payette from being able to do what's best for their communities. The other thing that came up during this discussion on the floor was a representative from Sandpoint asked, how hard would this be to change if we do run into another future pandemic? And, I think we are all kind of watching the bird flu situation evolve over time. And, there are things happening right now that may evolve in weeks or months that might land us in a situation where we would need these protections. And so there was discussion about this on the House floor. At the end of it all, it passed the House pretty overwhelmingly, 51-17, to go on. This issue has come up every year since the pandemic. The legislation has never fully made it past the finish line for various reasons. And so here we are again in 2025 looking at this issue again. So, next up it heads to the Idaho Senate. So there's a whole nother body that will be able to do that process of holding an introductory hearing, a public hearing, and then the full Senate would have to vote and then send it on to the governor. It would be interesting to see if the governor is down to pass something like this, where he has, advocated for local control during the pandemic and in other instances as well.
Christina, I want to go to the State House for a minute and talk about what happened earlier this week with a peaceful kind of protest commemoration of something that happened 10 years in the State House. And this was the Add the Words hearing. Can you quickly, for folks who may not have been here, give us some history and some background on this? Because it is something that I think for those of us who covered it 10 years ago, it's still very fresh in our minds.
Right. So for about 20 years, LGBTQ plus advocates have pushed state lawmakers to add the words sexual orientation and gender identity into the state's Human Rights Act for protections for employment, public accommodation, and housing. So essentially, over that last 20 years, some cities have added these protections on their own into their own city code. But overall, in Idaho, in some cities, you can still be fired in Idaho for being gay. You can still be denied housing or an apartment if you're gay or lesbian. And so there have been many efforts over those last 20 years to try to introduce these 4 words. Add the 4 words is the kind of phrase that advocates use to the state's Human Rights Act. And this week, hundreds of people came into the State House, held their signs up, walked through the rotunda, basically saying, we're here. One of the activists said that these laws that we talked about earlier in the program, that they can't erase us, that Idaho's LGBTQ community is here, proud, just trying to live their lives essentially, and that Republican lawmakers have put up this barrier to even holding a hearing on legislation that would allow these four words to be added to the Human Rights Act. And so this session, Idaho Senate Minority Leader Melissa Wintrow, a Democrat from Boise, introduced a personal bill seeking to add these protections to Idaho law. Personal bills don't really follow the same path that traditional bills go through in the legislative process. They're often used to send a message, used to say, we know this isn't going to be successful, but we're still introducing it anyway to get it on the radar. But the legislature does not hear or advance personal bills in their tradition. So that legislation is effectively going nowhere. But it was important to these community members to come to the State House, show that they are real, they have families, they're our neighbors and things like that, and to really still advocate for adding the words to the Human Rights Act.
Carly, I guess some good news in regards to teacher pay in Idaho. I mean, not great, but a little bit.
Yeah, so Idaho's average K-12 teacher pay has increased to nearly $63,000 this school year. That's about 2% more than last school year and a 42% increase over the past decade. But while Idaho's salaries have increased over time, they still don't compete with those in neighboring states. And on a national scale, Idaho has historically had some of the lowest paid teachers. There is some momentum to boost those salaries. Governor Brad Little kicked off this year's legislative session with a proposal for $84 million in raises for K-12 staff. So we'll see what happens with that. For now, average teacher pay varies widely across the state, from about $50,000 in the Meadows Valley School District to more than $90,000 in the Blaine County School District. For those interested, you can look up average teacher pay at any district or charter in the state on our website, idahoednews.org.
All right, thanks for that, Carly. Okay, Nate, I've got 1 minute left for you to tell us about this real-life Yellowstone film that's talking about a land dispute in Pocatello.
Yeah, this has been in the works for several years. It just premiered this week. It's called The Great Pocatello Land Grab. It basically is about a years-long dispute between two families and the city of Pocatello and some development companies who apparently came into eastern Idaho to build. And it went to court. This district court dismissed it, but it's now being going to be held by the Idaho Supreme Court. And the guys behind it, the two families, they say it's a real life version of Yellowstone. If you take out all the pretty people and the killing, it's got all the elements that Yellowstone had, with developers coming from out of town and either buying or getting influence and help from locals and local politicians. City of Pocatello isn't commenting due to legal proceedings. But yeah, the film is out. It's sold out in Pocatello. They had to add another showing to it this weekend, and it might, make its way around the entire state. Not sure about that.
All right. Thanks you so much, everyone. A huge thank you to our Reporter Roundtable. Nate Eaton, news director at eastidahonews.com, Carly Flandreau, reporter with Idaho Ed News, Christina Lords, the editor-in-chief of the Idaho Capital Sun, and Don Day, the founder and editor of BoiseDev.com. This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
If you like podcasts like this, explore more from the Boise State Public Radio podcast family. There you'll find a mix of daily news, Idaho Voices, and in-depth series on a wide range of topics. I'm talking wild horses, political scandals, sustainable ranching, and militia groups in a post-January 6th world. Wherever you get your podcasts, just search Boise State Public Radio to find what Idaho's NPR station has in store for you.